Hello. So, can everyone hear me? So I'm going to present about some of the lessons learned from Work Package 6 and also our expert advisory group, which I will come on to and tell you a bit more about. So people have probably already seen what roadmap is, the project, but I'll just briefly cover what the project was about. So really the goal of the project was to look at ways of using real-world evidence to deliver better outcomes for people with Alzheimer's disease and their carers. So that was bringing together multiple data sources, including real-world evidence, to look at how it could better improve decision-making for new treatments for people with the disease. So this was the structure of the project. I won't go into it in any detail, but I'll be talking about the orange panel on the right, which was our Work Package 6, which was HTA and regulatory engagement. And that's how it worked with across the different work packages of the project. So why regulatory and HTA engagement? Why was it important to the project? Well, before a new treatment, people can get access to a new treatment. It'll need to receive a license to be used and also decision for reimbursement in healthcare systems. So regulatory agencies will look at whether or not a product works. So look at its quality, efficacy and safety. And then subsequently, HTA bodies will look at how well a product works and how well it compares to other products and whether or not they provide value for money. They will make them recommendations to payers to whether or not to fund that within a healthcare system. So therefore it was seen as it would be really important to involve HTA and regulatory bodies in the project to influence new treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So Work Package 6, as I said, was set up to do that. It was a mechanism and platform for engaging with regulators, HTA bodies and payers, and really to ensure that the perspectives of these bodies were taken into account in the project's outputs and activities, and to look at how we can take into account their perspectives when looking at real-world evidence for Alzheimer's disease, and to provide some guidance and recommendations on how real-world evidence could be used for potential new treatments. So in terms of work streams for Work Package 6, the main work stream was to set up an expert advisory group, of which Entella, who will be speaking shortly, was one of our members. And that was made up of people who had regulatory and HTA backgrounds, representing different European countries. They were there as independent members, and they provided non-binding recommendations and feedback into the project. We held meetings approximately every 3 months, and they were either via teleconference or face-to-face meetings. And over the course of the 2 years, we had 6 meetings in total. So in terms of the meetings, we had some really good discussions, and they provided feedback and input on a number of topics which the different work packages brought to them for discussion. And this is just a list of some of the topics that were covered in those discussions. So looking at stakeholder prioritised outcomes for Alzheimer's disease, looking at the different disease stages across the disease continuum and the different outcomes at those stages, disease progression and health economic modelling, and also different approaches that could be taken for real-world evidence collection. And then moving on to the other work stream, which was around how we could provide some recommendations for using real-world evidence in Alzheimer's disease with the perspective of regulatory and HTA bodies taken into account. So there were 2 pieces of work that were done as part of this work stream. So the first one looked at currently marketed products for Alzheimer's disease and looked at the different experiences that we had with those products. So we looked at what the evidence requirements for regulators and HTA bodies were for those drugs, and we looked at the outcomes that were used in the decision making. And secondly, through the discussions that happened at the EXAG, we looked at the considerations for new disease-modifying drugs in Alzheimer's disease. So what did we find out from doing those pieces of work? So in terms of the first, looking at existing products in the market, the review found that there were similar evidence requirements across the regulatory and HTA assessments that have been done. So mainly randomized controlled trials that were used for those products. There was really limited use of real-world evidence, and that was mainly due to the number of randomized controlled trials that we used. The main difference was really in the choice of outcomes. So whereas the regulatory agencies focused on a couple of key endpoints, the HTA bodies looked at the totality of evidence, including health-related quality of life. And then from lessons learned from EXAG discussions, there were two key areas that came out of those discussions. The first related to priority outcomes for Alzheimer's disease. And the EXAG felt that there was a real lack of validated outcomes in the earlier stages of the disease. So those stages where a new disease-modifying drug might be placed in the market. So they felt that it was a real key priority to have a set of established, accepted outcomes, particularly within those earlier stages of the disease, but outcomes that would be accepted by regulators and HTA bodies when they were making their decisions going forward, and particularly able to demonstrate prevention or delayed onset of Alzheimer's disease. And then also the EXAG felt that we needed to make sure that we had some validated measurement tools which could be used across different settings, so things that weren't just used within a clinical trial, but could be used within real-world settings. And then finally, I think this one came out quite strongly within the EXAG, and that was the importance of caregiver-related outcomes and how important they would be to capture for both regulators and HTA assessors going forward. And then the other key area was related to real-world evidence. The EXAG felt that there were some gaps in real-world evidence sources, and that really came out through discussions around the data cube, which you may have already heard about, which there's a presentation on later. And that related to the different outcomes across the whole disease spectrum. And also that there was a lack of standardisation in the collection of real-world data. So the way that evidence is collected for these outcomes differs across different sources. They also had discussions around limitations in the use of real-world evidence. So HTA assessors will generally rely on clinical trials for their decision-making. So there was a discussion around whether or not real-world evidence could be used, and it was felt that there was a role going forward in real-world evidence use, and that it could really be used in terms of looking at disease progression and health economic modelling, and to look at the impact that the new treatments might have on carers and resource use. So looking at how disease stages correlate with different outcomes and endpoints, looking at the caregiver impacts of the and also providing that national perspective or regional perspective so that HTA's perspectives for different countries can be taken into account. And then finally, I'm just going to come on to some of the findings we had from using this as a format and mechanism for HTA and regulatory engagement. So we decided towards the end of the project that we wanted to do a survey of our consortium members and also the EXAG members to look at how well they felt that these platform had worked, and also to look at what the impact of the EXAG's feedback and input had been. So we received responses from 25 consortium members, and that was across 26 partner organisations, and also 5 of our EXAG members. So I'm just going to give you some highlights from the results. So we asked the consortium whether or not how they'd engaged with the EXAG, so whether or not they'd participated in meetings or attended meetings to observe. And there was a really high level of participation from the consortium. There was some less certainty about future engagement, but that was probably reflective of the fact it was towards the end of the project and there weren't that many meetings left. And then why people hadn't engaged in the project really were around people being new to the project, or not needing feedback on particular outputs or activities, or not being aware that they were able to nominate a topic for discussion. And then we looked at the role and impact. So people were generally positive about the EXAG and achieving the reason it was set up. And then in terms of the impact, people felt that it provided new insights into some of the work that had been presented, that there was really useful feedback. It confirmed some of the outputs that were being presented to the EXAG for discussion. There was less of an impact in terms of change of outputs and activities, but I think that was positive because I think that then meant that the project was already taking into account the HTA regulatory perspectives. And then we looked at areas for improvement and best practice. And really the areas for improvement were more around the kind of organisation of meetings. So people really valued the face-to-face meetings, and we didn't have as many of those as we were aiming to have. Some people felt that it would have helped to have more Q&A sessions, so we tended to run the meetings so that the people who presented could ask questions, but it would have helped to have wider question and answer sessions for people who were just observing. And some people felt that the EXAG needed to have broader membership, but on the flip side, we also had feedback that the group was the right size and reflected the right competencies and enabled some real challenging and informative discussions. And I've just provided a quote on the right-hand side just to kind of demonstrate how people felt that the impact of the EXAG. So just to conclude, the EXAG was really valued in terms of its role in providing feedback into the project, and hopefully has ensured that the project outputs and activities will be usable within an HTA and regulatory context. And in terms of the key findings, there was a real, the EXAG felt there was a need for consensus on priority outcomes for regulatory and HTA decision making for new treatments, and also that real world evidence did have a clear role to play within the new support decision making going forward. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I think we'll be taking them later, but if you want any more information, there's the roadmap website, nice website, and also my email address. Thank you.